Hello everyone. This presentation talks about HGD, Central Bank Regulation Rule versus USD. The team is composed of Yasser Boukeda, Corentin Simon, and mine, Mathias Joni. We're gonna talk about how does the mass work, mass versus the other central bank, Fed and BCE, and mass during the Asian crisis.
Reflecting the small open nature of its economy, Singapore has adopted an exchange rate-centered monetary policy framework since 1981. The exchange rate regime in Singapore is an intermediate regime that follows the basket bankroll system. With this managed float system, the MAS has successfully deterred speculators from attacking the domestic currency for most of the past 3 decades. At the same time, the flexibility accorded by the managed float system aided Singapore in escaping from the 1997-1998 Asian crisis relatively unscathed.
The primary objective of Singapore monetary policy is price stability for sustainable economic growth. Since 1981, Singapore's monetary policy has been strengthened on the exchange rate. MAS operates a managed float regime for the Singapore dollar. It manages the Singapore dollar against a trade-weighted basket of currency of Singapore major trading partner and competitor, and maintain it broadly within an undisclosed target band. When necessary, MAS intervenes in the forward exchange market to maintain the trade-weighted Singapore dollar exchange rate, also known as the nominal effective exchange rate, NER, within the policy band. MAS meetings are in April and October to ensure that it's consistent with economic fundamentals and market conditions. Unlike most other central banks, MAS does not target domestic interest rates. The theorem of the impossible trinity, also known as the open economy trilemma, posits that a country that maintains an open capital account cannot simultaneously manage its foreign exchange rate and domestic interest rate. Thus, Singapore's open capital account and exchange rate-based monetary policy implies that domestic interest rate and money supply are necessarily not controlled. The basket of currency for Singapore is, in terms of currency valuation, the most important exchange rate for the MAS is between the Singapore dollar and these 4 major trade partners like China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and just after us, US. Instead of driving monetary policy based on the value of the Singapore dollar against just one trading partner, MAS compares the Singapore dollar to several countries when making monetary policy decisions. By aggregating the exchange rate between the Singapore dollar and this currency, the MAS can maintain relative weakness relative to the majority of trade partners. The exact makeup of this basket is a guarded secret to prevent foreign countries from manipulating the balance of trade. MAS use a flexible wedge system. So what's a flexible wedge system? A flexible wedge is one that has a sizable variable components that allows company to adjust wedge costs quickly in several business downturns. The wedge system in Singapore is fairly flexible, as it allows for wedge reduction in difficult times, such as during the recession years of 1985 and 1998. In Singapore, the National Wage Council, NWC, which is a tripartite body of employer, union, and government, sent non-mandatory annual wage guidelines in the light of external market pressure on domestic inflationary concern in order to achieve orderly wage settlement consistent with macroeconomic objectives. The NWC was established in 1972, and its guidelines have been generally followed by the public sector and unions private sector of the economy. Other employers were also influenced by the guideline for fear of losing workers. Hence, the NWC guideline have a definite impact on wage in Singapore. Following the recession in 1985, Singapore has adopted a more flexible wage system. NWC has since drawn up a new monthly pay structure, comprising a basic wage and a monthly variable component, MVC. The pay structure also consists of an annual wage supplement at WS, and an annual variable bonus. However, only the public sector has adopted such a comprehensive pay structure, which allows for more flexible wage cuts in bad times. The private sector has adopted the AWS and an annual variable bonus, but not the MVC. Hence, unlike the public sector, it does not have the flexibility to make quick adjustments to wage cost, as it would have to wait for cuts in year-end bonus, annual wage supplement, or central provident funds (CPF) contribution rates. To make wage in the private sector more flexible, the NWC is advocating that companies should start introducing the MVC into the wage structure. Its aim is to build this component up to 10% of total wage over the year, when accomplished the structure of 80% of basic wage, and 20% of annual variable bonuses will be altered to this: 70% basic wage, 20% annual bonus, and 10% MVC.
As stated previously, MAS is unique in that it uses exchange rate policy rather than interest rate policy to regulate economic growth. While most central banks influence interest rates, the MAS effectively lets interest rates float based on the prevailing global interest rate environment, but I let Corentin talk you about these differences.
All developed nations use a central bank to help regulate and sustain economic growth. As we saw in the previous part, Singapore has a very different approach of the monetary policy than other countries. MAS is solely focused on controlling exchange rates rather than the interest rates to regulate the country's economic growth. In this part, we are going to compare the MAS with two other big central banks in the world, the Fed and the ECB. The Federal Reserve System is the central bank of the United States. It's composed of three key entities, including the Board of Governors, 12 Federal Reserve Banks, and the Federal Open Market Committee. The Fed is independent even if the President and the Vice President are named by the President of the United States. It's also a lender of last resort for banks during periods of great economic difficulties. Overall, the Fed has three work axes: full employment, price stability, and control of interest rates over the long term. Its main tasks are the monetary policy with the aim of fostering economic growth, but its flagship action is the interest rate. It's during the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, that happens 8 times a year that the Fed decides the monetary policy. The term monetary policy refers to the actions the Fed takes in pursuit of price stability, maximum employment, and moderate long-term interest rates. The Fed has and uses three main tools to influence monetary policy: the open market operation, because the Fed constantly buys and sells US government securities in the financial markets, which in turn influence the level of reserve in the banking system. The second operation is the setting the discount rate. That is the interest rate that banks pay on short-term loans from a Federal Reserve Bank, so that banks adapt by generally changing their interest rates too. The last one is setting reserve requirements that depository institutions are required to hold in reserve against deposits in bank accounts. The ECB is the European Central Bank and is the heart of the Euro system, which brings together all the national central banks of countries adhering to the single currency, the euro. It's composed of three different entities: the Board of Governors, that is in charge of the monetary policy, the Directorate that implements it, and the General Council that reports the impacts. The President or Governor of the ECB is named by the heads of countries of the Eurozone governments after advice from the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. The role of the ECB is to issue the currency and define the monetary policy and exchange rate policy to follow. Its main goal is to control the inflation in the Eurozone with an objective of an annual inflation less or equal to 2%. Among its other roles, the ECB protects purchasing power, supports growth and full employment. It's also a lender of last resort during periods of great economic difficulties, particularly for banks. To carry out its mission of controlling inflation, the ECB uses the same tools as the Fed: open market operation, the interest rate, and the reserve requirements. To summarize, the Fed and the ECB have a similar way of operating but a different organization and different goals. As we can see in this table, the MAS differs especially in the tools used to regulate its economy. The exchange rate-centered strategy by buying and selling on the exchange market instead of controlling interest rates. Its organization and goal differ too, which explains its good resistance to the Asian crisis, as Yasser is about to show you.
As we can deduct from the previous parts, the MAS economic policy is based on four fundamentals: an exchange rate policy, a healthy banking sector, an adjustable wage system, and controls on bank lending in the Singapore dollar. Now, it can be asked how the MAS is acting during crisis. Let's take the biggest crisis it faced. The Asian crisis started in 1997, mostly because of a speculative attack on the Thai baht. What is a currency speculative attack? A speculative attack is a precipitous acquisition of a currency that seems overvalued by previously inactive speculators. Most of the time, because of a lack of foreign currency reserve to pay the speculators, and coupled with a fragile economy, the central bank have to depreciate their own currency. Indeed, it happened when speculators borrowed a huge amount of local currency, the Thai baht, against the dollar. When baht lenders decided to convert back their money into dollars, Bank of Thailand ran out of dollar reserve. They had to devalue their currency. Let's illustrate the facts. For years, Thailand fixed their currency to dollar as the economy in the region was extremely good. A lot of investors lended Thai baht against dollar in Thailand to benefit from the interest rates, 11% in Thailand against 7% in the US. But investors, worrying about where that lending was going, in particular into real estate that is a good source of bubbles, they started progressively to take back their dollar, worrying about the economy. Facing a speculative attack and running out of dollar reserve, Thailand caused the beginning of the Asian crisis. How did the MAS react to this crisis? Of course, Singapore was impacted because as an exporter, a lot of Asian countries like Indonesia and Thailand are their main clients. First, they let their currency depreciate, but still, they were not as weakened as other countries. In fact, they did not get a speculative attack thanks to their reputation as a strong and serious country in terms of economic policy. Indeed, they already faced a speculative attack in 1985 and they went through it.
More precisely, the immediate depreciation of the SJD was sufficient to lower the benefit of further speculation. Thanks to a substantial amount of foreign reserves and the strong economic fundamentals, such as consistent fiscal surpluses, large current account surpluses and robust financial system, Singapore was relatively less affected by the Asian crisis.